Good evening and welcome everyone. And I will first call to order this work session for the Eugene City Council and turn it over to my colleague.
We were told to do that by our friends at the television. Good evening. Welcome to this work session, joint work session with the City Council and all commissioners present and accounted for.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all. So I am just going to take a moment to kind of run through the show here. We have about half an hour for the formal presentation. Both the city manager and the county administrator have some comments to make, and then we'll turn it over to our friends from the Technical Assistance Collaborative. So that'll take about half an hour, and then we will do rounds, 2-minute rounds, 2 counselors, followed by 1 commissioner, because there are twice as many of you, and so I will keep a queue, so wave at me. And should I already put you on?
Yeah, sure,
And I do want you to hold tightly to the timeline. If there's time, we'll be able to circle back for a second round for a few people, and then we'll do 1 counselor to 1 commissioner. And then we have a couple of general motions that we can look at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to the county administrator.
Thank you, Mayor and councilors. Good evening. Chair and commissioners, good evening as well. And to the members of the public that are here, thank you for joining us. I just have some brief comments, and the city manager I know wants to share some thoughts before we turn it over to the Technical Assistance Collaborative Group. I've long felt that local governments are the most effective level of government. We're the closest to the people and therefore have the greatest ability to be responsive to the needs of our communities. And I think certainly recent events have demonstrated the ability here for the city, the county, nonprofit partners, the advocacy communities to work together to identify solutions that are in the best interests of those in need throughout our community and the broader community as well. We've been really successful just in the past few months in connecting individuals to safer, healthier, and more permanent solutions. We have a long way to go, to be sure. And while much attention has been placed on emergency measures such as Camp 99 and unsanctioned camping in areas of our community, we're pleased to be here tonight to discuss long-term investments as a community to address our housing crisis and homelessness. The emergency measures that we've dealt with are critical, but we must also stay focused on solutions that help move people towards permanent housing, not just tents, that provide access to critical programs and services designed to help get people into permanent housing. The county's recent actions to invest $2 million into permanent supportive housing projects, 5 permanent supportive housing projects that will create 91 units of supportive housing throughout the community in the course of the next year to 2 years is a good example of that. Providing services to veterans, seniors, people with disabilities, youth exiting the foster care system, those with chronic mental health and homelessness issues. And the city's recent investments in similar projects demonstrate its commitment. And so we have strong momentum, a dedicated and passionate team of staff, and a community that is ready now to embrace a roadmap to solve our housing crisis and homelessness issues in our community. And I want to just take a moment. I know the city manager is going to recognize a few individuals, but there was so much work put in to these recent events and such great relationships built between our organizations over the past several months that I think are cause for celebration and for us to seize that momentum and opportunity that's in front of us. From the county side, I want to recognize Linda Bravo from our Human Services Division. She was our liaison from the county. Michael Johns, who is our operations chief from Public Works. Laurel O'Rourke, who is also liaison from Human Services. Lance Inglet from Public Works. Brian Johnson from Health and Human Services. And Steve Manila. We're all county staff that were integral in making sure that we were successful in partnering and solving issues in the community. And I know that the city manager has a group of incredible individuals from the city who were equally a part of these efforts that he will recognize.
Thanks, Stephen. Just excuse me, a couple of comments. First of all, I think it's a great report. Thank you for doing it. And I think the timing is just right for this particular report for a couple reasons. One is, over the last many years, we've had some nice incremental successes when we talk about car camping that started years ago, and the county has recently done some of that. Rest stops. We've been a part of that. OVE, Square One Village, Dusk to Dawn, Dawn to Dawn. Community Court, Operation 365, which was a nice partnership between the city and county and other agencies and folks in the community to actually move 404 veterans off the street. And what I would say is the county's efforts, continuing with those efforts, has been pretty spectacular. So I really appreciate that. Of course, Community Court has been in place for almost 2 years and is doing some really nice work and really needs some expansion room. And so we're working hard to try to expand that. 15th night on the youth side as well. And so there have been a lot of incremental successes, which I think is one reason why the timing's right for this report. Another is there's just, I think, an urgency and readiness in the community. The molecules are moving, and I think the challenge then for all of us, particularly the elected officials, as you provide policy guidance, is how to guide those, all of us in the molecules in really successful ways. The Community Safety Initiative, from our perspective, does many things in this space. Part of it, of course, is public safety, but as you know, much of that also deals with social services, human services, and how can we continue to fund those. And then the city-county partnership, I think, is as good or better than it's been in a long time in many reasons. And I think one of the things that we've learned through the Camp 99 experience is, or I should say relearned or confirmed, is that there are some really excellent folks in the county that are involved in this work and are extremely great partners and committed to this work. And so we appreciate that a lot. And lastly, I think now this joint strategic plan to achieve functional zero is coming right at the right time after we've had a variety of successes over the last many years. So I think we're ready and there's some urgency. I also would like to just note a couple of people from the Camp 99. In addition to the county and St. Vinny's and others, we had nearly 60 city employees involved one way or another during the transition and the setup of Camp 99. And I'll only mention a couple of them, but knowing there's many people behind them. First of all, Lieutenant Doug Mozam from the police department was our liaison and worked very closely with Linda Bravo in really, I think, in numbers of ways on a moment-by-moment basis. And so a special shout out to him. Also, out of our EPD, our animal welfare officer, Ted Carlson, did a lot with helping to transport and licensing of dogs, which is a critical and important part as part of this conversation in our public works, maintenance, and engineering. Particularly Scott Melovich and Matt Rodriguez, the division managers, helping to set up the site, getting a crosswalk across Highway 99 in a pretty timely manner. Also, Ben Miller out of our city attorney's office spent a lot of time with Steve Dingle and others in really trying to work through not always easy legal issues, but I think did a really nice job with that. And then finally in the city manager's office, Elena Domingo and Laura Hammond provided a lot of outreach and communications. And then lastly, a special shout out to Becky DeWitt, who really was a lead in the city manager's office in moving all of our efforts forward. So I just wanted to say thanks. I think we're ready, and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Great. And I will turn it over to you, Gina.
Thank you, everybody. Sorry. Thank you. Hello. Good evening. Thank you to the mayor, city council members, county commissioners for having us in the public, for inviting us back to talk to you guys again. We're very excited today. My name is Gina Shack. I'm here with Liz Stewart and Doug Tatro. We're from the Technical Assistance Collaborative. We see many familiar faces, so it's always nice. We're very excited tonight to be here to have a conversation around the work that has been going on for the last 9 months that's really culminated into the recommendations that we're going to outline and what ultimately round up as the final report. So just quickly, we're going to do a quick summary of our methodology, and then we're going to really spend the bulk of this presentation to really dive into the recommendation into more depth before we get into questions and answers. So started this report back in March of 2018, and it was very evident to us in the very beginning when we first started working with you all that everybody cares about this issue. You guys are all in this together, and everyone really they see the issue, the problem, and want to solve it. And we've had so many great communications and meetings and conversations with folks, and folks were just really ready to roll up their sleeves and dive into this. So initially, we received a lot of data from the county and the city and information, and we took all of that data and with that and doing designs of stakeholder interviews, looking at your current system designs, gathering up all that information, we were able to really analyze and assess what was going on in your system as a whole, not just around a need for a public shelter, but really the system as a whole and how you respond to crisis homelessness and crisis response system as it relates to homelessness. After that, we were able to develop a map of the system as a whole, and that really let us show, and I think we have a slide on it, but it's been circulated for a while now, but it really let us map out the way that your system looks, the resources that you have, where people flow through, where people get stuck, that sort of thing. And then the recommendations, from that, we were able to create or develop recommendations, and then we used some system modeling to right-size those recommendations for your specific community. And all of that really rolled up into the final report. So I just want to talk quickly about the assessment of the system, and this is important because this is why we wrote the report focused on. This is why we said what we said in the report is based on our general assessment. So I think everybody around the table knows that there's a huge problem in the unsheltered homeless population in Lane County. Single adults account for 83% of your unsheltered or of your entire homeless population, so sheltered and unsheltered. And then of the unsheltered homeless population in Lane County, 89% of those folks are single adults. So the majority of our recommendations are focused around that capacity. In 2018, your point-in-time count, it found that there were 53% of folks that were unsheltered, counted that night, were chronically homeless. 83% reported that they had 38 reported that they had serious mental illness, and 30% reported that they had substance use disorder. And again, those numbers are self-report, so people on the street were reporting that. So in reality, it may be much higher of the demographics of the folks that are living on the street in places not meant for human habitation. So we found some system capacity issues, right? Lane County in general, you were early adopters to a lot of the homeless system resources, models, and the way things are working. We'll talk a little bit more about the coordinated entry system, which is kind of the backbone of how folks should be able to access resources. But it's really, we found things and through emerging practices over the last 10 years, but really the last 5 years that are happening nationally. There are a lot of things that other communities are working on that worked well, shifting course. So we were able to look at your systems and compare that and broaden and put recommendations around how you can tweak that better, whether it comes to diversion, street outreach, coordinated entry, so that sort of stuff. And then I would not want to dismiss the fact that there are definitely external challenges that you all face in this community, as in any community, and it's really the demographics around Lane County, the very low rental, the low vacancy rate, and then the high rental and the stock of affordable housing is just not, it's not to scale for what folks have now. And then you also have a high number of newly homeless folks flowing into the system here. Okay, as I promised, we're going to dive right into the recommendations, and Doug's going to start us off on that.
Great. Thank you, Gina. Thanks, everybody, for having us. We really appreciate being back here and given an opportunity to talk through this again. I'm going to briefly go through this slide, and then we'll dive in more specifically, but if in case folks can't see it. So the final report contains 10 primary recommendations that we've come up with related to your homeless crisis response system here in Lane County. We're going to cover a number of different issues, from outreach to the implementation or expansion of diversion services, better coordination of some of your permanent housing resources like your rapid rehousing portfolio, the expansion of permanent supportive housing, which we've spoken at length about here on multiple occasions, move-on strategies, the better utilization and training around tenancy supports, what Gina had mentioned, some changes to coordinated entry, as well as some ideas around landlord management and housing partners, training, and of course the low barrier emergency shelter that we had discussed. And I just want to echo the comments from earlier around the partnerships that have developed over the last number of years, and it sounds like in the last couple of months. When we look at these recommendations, we're looking at them as a package and as a series of different angles and lenses to look at improvement that work together to create positive change. And that requires leadership from the city, from the county, from the nonprofits, from the public in the room, from your public housing authorities, and of course consumers and people with lived experience who probably know your homeless crisis response system better than most of us do in terms of how to navigate that and making sure that their voices are heard. So we'll dive in. We're going to go through quickly because we want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So the first recommendation that we highlight is around expanding and better coordinating outreach. We do discuss the addition of 5 full-time equivalent outreach workers, but what the bread and butter to this is really the improvement and ongoing coordination of outreach in the field to make sure that teams that are targeting different geographies or different people with perhaps different mental health issues or different conditions are talking to each other, and that there's a pathway, a connection from that outreach spot to the housing and services that folks need who are outside. So not only adding capacity from an outreach perspective, but adding capacity to coordinate those outreach activities. That also includes making sure that we're leveraging mobile technology, that we're leveraging the ability for outreach workers to have the tools that they need, not in their office, but where they really work, which is in the field and in the city, to make sure that they can communicate back to the broader housing network. And we talked a little bit about earlier today, too, is making sure that your outreach teams are leveraging peer support. So people in the city and the county who have been homeless or previously homeless or are homeless now, helping them reach out to folks that may need services and try to identify those folks more quickly and link them back into services. The next, and we'll go through these quickly here, the next recommendation, working with outreach, to couple with outreach, is expanded diversion activities. So homelessness diversion is an emerging practice. It's one that very few communities have figured out, but one that we are all quickly realizing is really important. And this is about engaging with folks who are presenting for services at the moment that they're asking for shelter or help, and trying to find alternative immediate options for those folks other than shelter or homelessness. Is there some other place that you can be tonight other than on the street or shelter? And we'll continue to work with you on a long-term housing plan moving forward. But let's keep you out of our shelter tonight because we don't have the capacity to provide shelter to everybody right now. So for those of you who have a friend or a family member or a safe place to be just for today or the next few days, let's work on that. So we do recommend adding diversion specialists both at your emergency shelter front doors as well as other crisis centers and in your outreach teams. And again, leveraging consumers and people with lived experience to help you do that. We can talk more about that if you'd like. The next recommendation, so we've got outreach, we've got this diversion activity, that front door of your crisis system, is the expansion and coordination around rapid rehousing. So a lot of discussion, rightly so, has focused on permanent supportive housing resources, and we'll talk about those. Another housing intervention that's proven to work for many households is rapid rehousing. So short to medium-term rental assistance with services. It rapidly moves people toward a private rental market and then tries to wrap services around those folks for a period of time that allows them to either bring their income up or search for other longer-term housing options. One of the things, and I think I said this in our initial testimony a few months back, is it's very difficult to do rapid rehousing very well. It's a highly specialized type of project. It's one that has emerged in the last 10 or so years, and The communities that have done it well have been able to consolidate rapid rehousing services to those providers that can do it really well, but make sure that those resources and those services are available to the broader community so that it's not just whoever has that money serves their clients, but that we're working through coordinated entry to make sure that rapid rehousing is readily available to the extent you have the funds to folks that walk in any door, and that you have a strategy for identifying those people and targeting that. And that also includes training, which is a later recommendation. So I'm going to turn to Liz to talk about PSH.
Okay, thanks, Doug. So our next recommendation is on creating additional permanent supportive housing and increasing utilization of your existing resources that are permanent supportive housing. So if you look at your portfolio now, you have about 500 units that are dedicated to serving single adults that are PSH. And when you look at the actual numbers of unsheltered and some of those statistics that Gina mentioned, that there are a significant number of folks that are experiencing chronic homelessness, that may have serious mental illness, that may be experiencing substance use disorder. The need for additional units is really there because the system is not meeting the demand for those types of units, which basically permanent supportive housing is long-term housing and support services for people with disabilities. And so the need is really there. So we're suggesting that you create 350 new PSH units that may include new development, so construction of new units. Sounds like you're already working on projects to do that, as well as adding additional resources to either tenant-based or project-based subsidies that could be used in existing developments. In addition, we think that you really need to work on increasing your utilization of existing PSH resources. So if you look at some of your system performance measures right now, you're looking at around 87% utilization of the existing resources there. So we're suggesting that you try to improve that utilization, which would mean that you'd end up serving more people in those units. And the ways that we recommend you doing that are by ensuring that PSH referrals are happening through the coordinated entry system. So right now, not all units are actually being accessed through the coordinated entry, which means that you're not really ensuring that the people that need PSH the most at the moment that they need it are actually getting served. In addition, we think that you really need to make sure that there's proper training around tenancy supports in place as a system. So ensuring that all providers have the capacity to provide those tenancy supports, and there are specific expectations and standards around that. So one of the things that we looked at, again, at the system-wide is that there is around a 21% returns to homelessness after 2 years when someone exits to permanent housing. So there's definitely maybe some improvements that could be made there around when someone actually gets housed. You're using these, really limited resources to house someone, and then within 2 years' time, you're seeing that folks are re-entering the system back into homelessness. So what kind of tenancy supports could be expanded to ensure that they maintain that housing? Also ensuring that PSH is coordinated with system-wide landlord outreach and relationship management, making sure that you're leveraging reasonable accommodation. So again, that's probably another training piece to ensure that providers really know how to use reasonable accommodation effectively, because these folks do have a lot of barriers to housing. And then considering increasing the PHA payment standard so it's more competitive in the private market. In addition to additional PSH, we think it's really important as part of looking at PSH is implementing effective move-on strategies. So when we looked at the PSH portfolio, right now there's about a 2% turnover rate. So what that means is that people are really, once they're getting into PSH, they're not leaving. And it is designed to be a long-term housing strategy, but not everyone needs to be living, in a unit assisted with PSH, for their lifetime. They may be able to, move on from that unit. The problem really is the affordability piece. They may not need the services any longer. They may not need that intense service package, but they do need the housing assistance piece. And so what we're suggesting is move-on units are an emerging practice, that you really look at your whole portfolio of housing units that are either in the PHA portfolio or through other mainstream affordable housing, and seeing if you can make targeted provided units for folks that are leaving PSH to have some kind of preference to allow them to move on to either those subsidy opportunities or other existing units, and that you have a process in place to identify folks that are able to do that. You want it to be a voluntary strategy, but a lot of times if folks know that there's another opportunity that doesn't require the services that they don't need, they're willing to do that. And there's some other incentives around that too that we could talk about later if you're interested. Next up, we talked a little bit about this, is expanding, increasing utilization of tenancy supports. So one of the things that we heard when we were talking to different providers and consumers is that, there's not always the level of services that they need to either remain housed or where there aren't services, some providers may not be willing to house folks because they don't feel that the level of services there to ensure that housing stability. So we, think that that's definitely an area that needs to be looked at more closely. And making sure that providers can effectively bill for those type of pre and post tenancy supports. So really having housing-focused tenancy supports in place. So it's great to help people move towards their personal goals in life, but when we're talking about real tenancy supports, making sure that they have the services in place to make sure that they are maintaining their housing, things related to the lease, that they understand, what it is to be a good tenant, that they know how to pay their rent, they know if they have a question about anything in their unit, they know who they can call, if they have a leak, that they know they need to let the property owner know, and that there's also sort of a relationship between the service provider and the property owner to make sure that relationship is there. And then next, we also have some recommendations around coordinated entry. So, one of the things that we've mentioned before is that as a system, this community actually adopted coordinated entry fairly early on compared to some of the other communities we work with that are still not necessarily checking the boxes of what's required. And so that's really great. But there have been some new strategies and, emergency practices that have come out from working with other communities nationwide that we really think if you started employing those, you would actually see large improvements in how people are able to quickly access the resources that are available, and ensuring that the folks that need those resources the most are getting access to them. So some of our specific recommendations are, again, making sure that every unit that is dedicated to serving homeless people, that those are using referrals through the coordinated entry system. We are suggesting that you add 2 county-level assessors with walk-in and phone capacity to do assessments. Right now, that is not necessarily there system-wide. We also suggest having more housing navigators on the ground to help with, working with landlords, doing housing search, getting people document ready, all those things to get people from off the streets into housing as quickly as possible. Using a single coordinated wait list for your PSH and rapid rehousing. Right now, it's there's sort of separated list, which is sort of causes sometimes the folks that are most vulnerable not to get access to the resources that are available. Having a more phased assessment approach so that not everyone needs to get a full assessment right away. Sometimes that just ends up taking up more time. And we also, one thing we notice is that a lot of folks end up getting assessed to eventually end up sort of getting removed from the list because of an expired assessment. Not everyone needs to have a full assessment, especially if they're never going to make it to the top of that list. Establishing case conferencing process to make sure there is that system-wide coordination between coordinated entry, outreach, diversion, that all of those folks are a part of the coordinated entry system, and that, it's happening on a system-wide level.
Moving along. We're moving quickly through our slides here. So following up on that, one of the, I think, most undervalued but most important partners in ending homelessness is your housing partners and your landlords and folks that actually have units available, whether they're subsidized or in private rental markets, and this can be a big challenge. So part of our recommendations is really trying to think much more strategically and creatively around your landlord networks and actually thinking about your landlords and housing partners in more of a centralized way. So traditionally, in homeless services across the country, provider A has their landlord friends, and provider B has their landlord friends, and those providers don't talk to each other because they're worried about losing those relationships, burning bridges that they've built with landlords who are willing to rent to their clients. So what we would suggest is thinking about or considering a centralized management process for your housing units. So much like you may have heard of a by name list where we get to understand the needs and desires of the people we're trying to serve so that we can better serve them, having a landlord by name list where we can understand the risk aversions, the types of units landlords have, their willingness to rent to clients with different types of barriers, and actually having people responsible for managing that portfolio. Part of the risk of that is if provider A is providing a higher standard of service to the landlord than provider B is. So along with having a centralized management tool, there needs to be mutual expectations for what type of responsiveness and relationship management needs to happen between the provider providing services and the housing partner that owns the unit. And so we've seen other communities, and we would suggest here housing partner handbook, basically an MOU process where providers who want access to this really great landlord pool that you've created, that you're managing, also need to commit to a minimum level of services and responsiveness when there's a crisis or when a landlord calls and they're very upset or they didn't receive their check on time or there's parties going on, that there is that responsiveness. So not only centralizing and really trying to better coordinate your housing partners with you as partners, but also making sure that the providers that are supporting the people in those units are held mutually accountable to a minimum level of services to make sure those relationships don't get burned. And then we did mention here, and I didn't mention it verbally, but in the diversion and outreach context as well, some limited targeted financial assistance or for diversion and outreach, as well as a risk mitigation fund for landlords, which we can speak to more as we go. And then as landlords are often undervalued, at least those relationships are, another undervalued thing I think in the social service world, especially outside of clinical settings where people are not necessarily clinicians, is training and ongoing professional development. The nonprofit and homeless service field has a lot of turnover, and there's always new things that people are trying that are turning into promising practices over time. So having an ongoing professional development and training protocol within the continuum of care with your partners is really important. And some of that costs money, and there's commitment to spending money on training, but others are free. There's a lot of resources out there, and there's providers that can put together a minimum level of expectations for their direct care staff, their managers, in terms of how they operate, how they work, that can better everyone's practice over time. And as you have case conferencing, as people are communicating and cross-pollinating that knowledge, the entire wave rises, right? And people begin to really engage on that. Training is also important when it comes to folks who may not buy in or be accepting of things like housing first or some of these practices that are hard on providers. Training and education is a way to bring some of those folks on board, whether it's at the personnel level or the organizational level. So really looking at your training opportunities, both paid and free, and again, holding each other accountable, particularly in the nonprofit space and the provider space, to meeting those expectations.
Okay, and last but not least is recommendation number 10. So that is the recommendation of creating a new 75-bed year-round emergency shelter that is low barrier. And the idea is that right now, there is no place for somebody, an individual who's living on the street who has very, very high barriers to accessing existing shelter can go to be safe at a night. We did, the report goes into much more detail, but we did want to highlight that the recommendations around the low barrier shelter really are the model of the navigation centers that have been being developed around the country. Most of them are actually on the West Coast at the moment, but it's a new emerging practice around emergency shelter, and they've only been around for a couple years, but there's been a lot of focus on them and a lot of research, and the research has really steered the best practices or the emerging best practices that would make this shelter low barrier and successful for the folks that you're trying to target. So that's where the recommendations are really around a navigation center-like model. The shelter considerations, which the report goes much more detail into, it's around land and property use. There's going to be a cost associated depending on how you acquire the new building or the property. There's the location of the shelter. shelter. Ideally, it's easily accessible, whether it's walkable or accessible by public transportation. And then the shelter structure layout. The navigation centers themselves that are out there look very different from one another. Sometimes they're modular homes, sometimes or modular structures. Sometimes they're trailers that they've put together. Sometimes they're, unused permanent supportive housing units that eventually a developer will redevelop. So they can look a lot. The actual structure of it looks a lot different within the navigation centers. So the report outlines some of those, and the accessibility of the shelter. So you may have people with disabilities that may have mobile impairments. So to make sure that there's accessibility standards and consideration when thinking about it. And then in the appendix, the costs associated with some of those different models and layouts will change. And then the other aspect of it that's really important when doing the shelter or developing the shelter is the actual operations. So the principle behind the shelter, to make sure that it's the shelter represents and everybody in the community understands what the shelter is for, that it has a guiding principle and a vision of being accessible to people who are your most vulnerable folks, that have barriers, that can't go to other shelters, that aren't going to have anything else that night if they don't go into your shelter, the 75-bed shelter that night. And then other operations around dedicating resources that would be attached to the back-end resource to the shelter to help people get out of the shelter. The navigation models have shown that if there's no back-end resource, whether it's we suggested rapid rehousing or even a voucher, they're going to stay in the shelter longer. The research has also shown that setting arbitrary time limits on the shelter is no good. You're helping somebody in an expensive shelter model and then releasing them back or sending them back or enforcing them back to go into homelessness. So it's not having arbitrary time dates. So having that back-end resource and dedicated to that the shelter has really made the movement go faster. And then we outlined some staffing structure. And in any of these recommendations, and as you all go through implementing these recommendations over the next couple of years, continued evaluation and program and project and performance measurements are just going to be key to making sure you're on goal, and you're committing a ton of money into these efforts, and you want to make sure they're going the way. And you may have to switch course along the way, but as long as you're evaluating and measuring it through the way, I think you'll know that sooner rather than later.
So as we close out here our presentation, so what does this all mean? So everyone in this room wants to end homelessness, not just unsheltered homelessness, but homelessness for a variety of reasons. And the recommendations that we've put forth are meant to impact that and put Lane County and Eugene on a pathway toward that. The takeaway, I think, from our recommendations is that building an emergency shelter alone will not solve your challenge with homelessness in this county or this city. However, it is a critical tool as part of a larger system implementation strategy, and that all of these recommendations work together, from engaging with folks who are outside right now who need to be offered a different type of service for us to provide that incentive for them to engage, to looking for alternatives to shelter for people who have other family and natural supports, to looking at the most appropriate or at least most immediate housing resource that can be available to people, to coordinating ourselves and making sure that our partners are at the table, that we have consumers at the table, that you all are at the table as you are today. But over time, we think that if these recommendations are adopted and implemented, that you can make a meaningful long-term impact on the homeless population here in Lane County, and particularly over the next couple of years, that unsheltered population where folks are in a safe place and they're on a pathway, there's a flow toward permanent housing solutions, because homelessness is not a condition of somebody, it's a situation, and our job is to try to solve that situation with them as partners in that solution. And so that brings us, and I think this is part of your conversation around next steps. It's always great to talk about, we have all these things to do, but we've seen time and time again in communities that say we want to go solve problems, here's all the things we need to do, and you walk away from a meeting and there's no action item and nobody responsible for those action items. So making sure that you all collectively have decided on your point people for these different needs to make sure that you're prioritizing what you feel you can do now versus what needs to be phased in, and really holding each other and yourselves accountable to what am I responsible for accomplishing in the next 30 or 60 or 90 days, and I'm going to be able to report back that I've made progress on that to my colleagues and to the community as we move forward. So I think that concludes, and there's a sample action template. Action templates are always great when they're mostly blank because it doesn't prescribe the goals that you're trying to achieve. Those are things that you self-determine locally, but really making sure that carrying out of this that there is that implementation plan, which I think is part of the conversation following this. And I think that is all that we have, and we did it in our 33 minutes, I think. So.
That is great. Thank you very much. Very succinct wrap up. So my plan is to call on 2 counselors and then turn to my colleague, Commissioner Sorensen, to keep a queue of your commissioners.
Go around the table for us, just to keep it simple.
Okay, well, I'm going to let you oversee that, and I'll just do the council side of it. And I have Counselor Clark and then Counselor Syret, and then Counselor Select in the next round.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much for that presentation again. Very well done. This is very thorough work. I appreciate it, and I think it can help us to solutions. I don't know about completely solving this problem, and I think you mentioned that too. That's an interesting way to approach it. But there's a couple of things that jump out at me, and they don't seem to be addressed, and it's not that the report is lacking because they're not addressed. It's just they don't seem to be intuitive. And so I'm wondering why, or if maybe you thought about it and decided not to address it. Here's one. On page 3, a high number of unsheltered in the assessment portion where you say that single adults account for 83% of the homeless population and 89% of the unsheltered population. That rings true for me. We also had a report from an economist group about low-income housing where they mentioned that single people living alone in Eugene do so more frequently than any other city in the state, our size, or on a per capita basis. As a matter of fact, Salem, as a city with almost the exact same number of people that there are in Eugene, has 54,000 housing units of any type, where in Eugene we have 63,000 housing units of any type. So even the number of houses we're building supports the idea that we're assuming adults should live alone. Now here's my question. Why? Why aren't we assuming that if the government is stepping in to assist that we require adults not live alone? We'd house twice as many people. Why is that something you studied and didn't address intentionally or didn't address for a reason? I'd love to know, or what your thoughts are on it.
I don't know if we made an active decision to address or not address shared housing, and I think we had discussed it back in October a little bit, this notion. It is a strategy that goes with training. I'd hesitate to talk about requiring roommate situations.
How come, if you don't mind my
Depends on the size of the housing unit. And the type of space that is reasonable for 2 people to live in. But if you have a 2-bedroom unit, that has separate spaces. But what I will say is there are, and this is certainly something from a training perspective and can be explored, a lot of really good models around shared housing in terms of not only leveraging the incomes of both parties to try to maximize the dollar that's being assisted, but also in terms of matching people. So if you put roommates together, as any roommates may be, you want to make sure that those roommates are going to be able to get along in that unit because the tenancy preservation of that unit is the most important. So there's actually some examples that are online around roommate surveys that people can fill out, so it gives people an opportunity to make choices about who they may live with. That would be a longer-term solution. And again, recognizing that maybe they need to live with a roommate or 2 for 6 months or a year or 2 years, but that eventually they may move on to their own unit. But in terms of requirements, I think you have to look closely at the types of units that you're using and making sure that there's reasonable space for people, that there's privacy, and that it is a permanent housing situation, and that they're not just sort of being grouped, 3 people in 1-bedroom apartment. So there's a little bit of play there. But if you have a 3-bedroom apartment, yeah, 3 people should probably live in that apartment.
That kind of answers my question. I have more and only 1 second, so I will ask for a second round to follow up on that. Thank you.
Great. Councilor Seywright.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I am very impressed with this report and the level of scrutiny you've applied to our current system and the level of detail of your recommendations are very impressive. I feel like we definitely got our money's worth out of the work here. So in my mind, this lays out a set of realistic and achievable recommendations. I have served on our Human Services Commission for over a decade, and I'm pretty familiar with what services are provided. And this set of recommendations points the way forward to utilize our current system to its best effect. And with the addition of a single low barrier shelter, we could eliminate the need for our emergency temporary shelters in the form of rest stops and dusk till dawn programs. And according to this report, if we really go all in on these recommendations, virtually end homelessness in our community within 3 years of full implementation. That is a far more optimistic outcome than I was expecting from this report. So I am excited to have us embrace these recommendations jointly and get to work on implementation. I know that our respective staff members are ready to partner, and I believe these two elected bodies are ready to recognize that we need to rely on each other to really make a difference in the crisis of homelessness in our community. So I hope my fellow councilors will embrace these recommendations and support the motion staff has provided to us as we work on this. We can do this, and we should. You know, it will require some change in our current practice. You know, there are recommendations in here to have more county staff that's doing some of this work rather than asking nonprofits to do it on a contract basis, and also asking our nonprofits to change some of their practices, such as more street outreach and walk-in services. So it'll take some adjustments, but I think obviously it would be worth the outcome.
Thank you. Turn it over to commissioners.
Okay, Jay?
So I just want to say it's a good report, but I do want to note that connected in it, just in the recommendations on their face, are 40 FTE in the 10 recommendations, not counting the probably 100 plus FTE you'll need to staff 350 supported housing units. That's a big reach to sustain that, and Salt Lake City is starting to see some of the stress from trying to sustain their system. But I won't get into the capital costs and all that. The main thing I'd like to ask is, can we get access to the input data, the actual mathematical model, and be able to play with that model? I'm an engineer. I spent most of my career doing mathematical modeling of natural systems. I want to test it. All I see in the modeling appendix is numbers that show results basically based on some input assumptions. You know, I want to see really how we get to zero, and I want to trust that model. You know, it's the basis on which all these recommendations hinge. So, you know, and I also know that Councilor Van Gordon from Springfield is very interested in seeing that model too. Also an engineer. I imagine Councilors Lincoln might be interested.
For the record, we're not engineers. And to be, you know, to be, I mean, to be completely transparent, so the model, the tool that we have is something that we use internally with other communities. It's not something that we are necessarily willing to share, but we can walk through, you know, how those assumptions were calculated. So one of the things that I think it's important to understand is that we did use some assumptions around the number of folks that can be diverted and the number that self-resolve. So when you look at some of the other communities that, again, it's an emerging practice, but I think it was maybe a project in Los Angeles that kind of had tracked those numbers, but they were able to show that they were able to divert around 30% of the folks that had came into their, had tried to access the system through those conversations that Doug was talking about. So there's right away, you're diverting folks from even entering the system. And then when you look at the length of times, and this is all data that was provided to us directly from the county, it's all coming from HMIS, including the turnover rates and the utilization. When you're looking at the number of the length of stay in the current emergency beds that are there, the majority of the folks are actually exiting within 7 days. And so, the assumption there is that a large portion of them are actually self-resolving, whereas you see a lower percentage that are actually taking up a much longer period of time, kind of clogging up those resources. So part of the modeling was assuming that you could get that self-resolution, that those folks wouldn't necessarily need any of the existing housing resources that are in the COC, so not needing to access rapid rehousing or PSH. So part of the modeling is just assuming that a lot of folks would get served without even actually accessing the housing resources. Then we basically sort of modeled in if you were able to serve all the people that are currently unsheltered who were not either self-resolving or diverting, and then increasing the utilization rate. So right now, for example, I think in rapid rehousing, there was like a 70% or so utilization rate. So what could happen if you got up to 85%? That's a 10% increase in utilization. And just seeing what that and increasing turnover rates to successful housing. It's sort of, it's simple mathematics. It is not, it's not any, it's not kind of any engineer level, I guess, analysis that was occurring. It's more in line with some of the other models that we've seen out there for sort of system modeling in the homeless system.
Can I add just 2 very brief comments for matter of public record? One being that the recommendations were developed based on the analysis, conversations, and interviews. So the recommendations sort of preface the modeling. The modeling is a way to sort of example out or think through what could this do and tease that out in sort of a summary form. The other thing I just want to clarify, because it's been said a couple of times that we're going to be at 0 in 3 years. The report talks about your capacity to be at nobody unsheltered, having the capacity to make sure that nobody needs to be unsheltered. It does not suggest that there's no homelessness or people who need to be sheltered homelessness. And there's it's an important distinction that there will be people who are in shelter that are continuing to work toward permanent housing, but you would have the capacity and the ability to move people through quickly enough that you would be able to absorb anybody who's unsheltered. So I just want to make sure that's clarified.
I understood that in the report. I just, the report was paid for with public dollars, which makes whatever was developing the report somewhat public information. It'd be really nice to be able to examine the model. It's just my point of view, especially, and one of my concerns is, you mentioned LA, and there's been some mention of other large cities. We're not that large of a municipality. We're much more rural, so some of the predictions, if they're based on an LA, might not necessarily work. I just want to have a clear understanding of that.
Hey, Councilor Zelenka.
Thank you very much. This is an awesome report. I agree with everything that Claire said. It's very impressive. We did get our money's worth. And I've been working on this Human Services and Commission back in the early 90s and working on this for 25 years. And this feels very different. It is different. It's a different approach. It's a different way of looking at it, and the recommendations are things that we have not seen before. So this is not the same old, same old. This is completely different in my mind, and getting us on a glide path to 0 unsheltered, not 0 homelessness, but unsheltered people in our community over a 3-year period is an exciting potential. I was very skeptical of a shelter, and it was a good use of our funds because it looked like a lot of money to build one with a lot of people to staff it, easy to get the money to build it, hard to get money to operate it. But the navigation center model is different from that model, and it makes sense to me. The cost seemed doable at 1.6, maybe probably more than that when it's all said and done, $790 for staffing. But you didn't see in here operating costs. You punted on that one. That's a question.
Okay. So we tried to start mapping out operating costs, and there are so many variables in what different navigation centers look like. So I think some of the choices around what your navigation center is going to look like is going to affect the operating costs. The other difficulty around having anything that would be tangible or useful around operating costs would be how your local taxes, your utilities, we don't know if it'd be gas or electric, is it garbage pickup? Like, there's all these kinds of operating costs that we don't, it wouldn't have been useful to include them in that. We looked at some of the operating costs for the dawn to dusk model, but those were tents, not a permanent structure. So it was really, I think there are gonna be operating costs. They are likely going to be high, but it's gonna be really based on the model and the decision of the models, I think.
Yeah, it's not going to be insubstantial
Yeah.
either. It's going to be
Yeah.
thousands of
Yeah.
dollars, if not $1 million. So maybe that's something staff can work with them to get a range of operating costs so we can get a sense of what the shelter total budget would be.
Yeah.
Tenancy support intrigues me and piques my interest quite a bit. I read what you said, budget assistance to ensure that they're pay their rent on time, keeping apartments clean, support requests for accommodations, a positive relationship with property owners. Is there, in case management staff, I kind of get what that means, but I'm not sure what that means. Is there a way to get us more information about more specific examples? For instance, we have a construction excise tax that we're going to put into place, and some of that money could go directly for this kind of thing to keep people in their houses and keep them in affordable housing as opposed to just having them go out of housing into homelessness. It should be kind of like the first thing we do. So if we get some more information on that. The other thing on the budget, okay. There's one more thing. There's a couple of holes in the budget too. D, E, and F aren't there.
Right. We had no cost recommendation, but there will be a cost associated with it. We just don't know. So for additional PSH and increased utilization, this study didn't encompass that. You could do that would be a whole other study to really do a cost analysis of creation and better utilization of PSH. So that didn't encompass that scope of that, but we didn't want to say there's no cost. We just don't have a recommendation for what that would look like locally. As well, with the move-on strategies, I think it's going to depend on the approach you take to use those move-on strategies. If they're housing choice vouchers that already exist or project-based vouchers that already exist that you would move that folks would move on to, they're already there, so there might be a cost to the PHA to administer it, but we don't know what resource you would use for that. And as well as expanding tenancy supports, those costs could be offset by your match with Medicaid, and depending on how you use your partnership around tenancy supports with your local coordinated care organization, Trillium.
Can I add one more
Yeah.
thing? On the tenancy support thing, there's a lot we can talk about with specific strategies, but I think it's also a shift in culture from traditional social services, and I don't want to imply this is true in Lane County, but generally, social service try to fix people. We need to solve their homelessness. That is our job. And their goals and their other challenges they may face in their lives that they may or may not want to address come after our ability to make sure that their tenancy can be sustained. So if somebody has an active addiction, well, if they have an active addiction and they can have that addiction safely and it doesn't lead to their eviction, then that might not be our priority until we make sure they're stably housed. So it's a reorientation of how we think about our jobs and what our end goal is. Are we trying to fix people? Or are we trying to end homelessness? And they're two different approaches when it comes to case management.
Hey, Councilor Pryor.
Thank you. Did we get our money's worth? For me, yes. And it's not based on me looking at this list and saying, oh, I see all kinds of new stuff here that I didn't see before. Over the last 10 or 15 years, most of the things on this list we've talked about. We've talked about in this community. The problem has been we have talked about them individually and separately. Like wheels that turn at different speeds in different directions, but they're not attached to anything. And what you have done is bring all of those together, attach them to the car, and get them all moving at the same time, in the same direction. To me, that's the most critical element, because this will not work unless it all works together at once. I mean, that's, for me, the key takeaway. Don't keep approaching this as a series of individual initiatives. It's a coordinated collective of things that need to be done. Yes, it is an absolute heavy lift, and we must be committed to do it. And one thing I'm looking for is to go beyond coordination which is in many of your recommendations here, coordinate outreach, coordinate rapid rehousing, coordinate entry. Coordinating is great. I know what you're doing and I know what you're doing. I want to move beyond knowing what you're doing. I want to move to cooperation, which is, yes, I will work with you to make this happen. I don't want to just know what you're doing. I will work with you to do it. And I think it is one of our responsibilities as government to work to ensure that all of these different wheels cooperate with each other so we all spin at the same time in the same direction. And that has not always been our history here. For whatever reason, there has not always been a desire to cooperate for a host of reasons. And I think what we can do, part of what we can do, is to provide incentives and opportunities for all of the different players who are already here to cooperate. And it will take will and it will take energy to do that. But with that, I think then we can achieve success.
Joe, and if not Joe, then Pat.
Eventually you'll get to me, so please.
Well, who's going around the table, Joe? Go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me? I don't know. Is this on? It's hard for me, first time here, it's hard for me to contain the passion, knowing the pain and anxiety and sense of hopelessness amongst many that we seem to be talking about in such professional terms. So I have a question. I understand your methodology, and I appreciate your intent. On table 1, I believe on page 4 of your report, it says 251 families with children and 25 children without families are homeless. On August 9th, 2018, our Register Guard reported that 1,835 children were considered homeless in the Eugene School District. 550 were considered homeless in the Bethel School District. 463 were considered homeless in the Springfield school districts. That's 3 of 12 or 13 or 16 school districts. The same article identified that on any given night, almost 400 students in Eugene, just ages 16 through 18, struggle to find a place to sleep. So in just those 3 districts, 2,848 young people that are students are homeless. And more students in that report are identified as homeless in Oregon than during the Great Depression. So my question is, how do you resolve, because I am having difficulty with it, and I don't want to hear about how data is collected. How do you resolve these numbers for children and families, much less the scale of these numbers, with a proposal that is entirely looking at a different group? And that's part 1 of my question.
Good job, Joe.
Is it yes, no?
Sure. Well, so I'm going to say it, but we used the data that was collected based on the parameters of how HUD defines and collects homelessness based on definitions. The Department of Education at a federal level as well as at local levels have a broader range of homeless definition, so their numbers are much bigger with children. That doesn't make it any less of a problem because you're parsing definitions. We, when using our definition in our world, in our HUD homeless world, looked at these numbers. The sheer volume of your unsheltered homeless numbers was so large that our report really focused on getting those resources and the systems around those resources in order to lower that number. I think if you do all of the recommendations and as they're implemented, you will see the other parts, the other subpopulations, families, children, youth in your system to start to lower their numbers as well, because it's a system-wide change when you're adding more rapid rehousing and learning how to use or place folks in rapid rehousing better. And your coordinated entry system isn't just for individuals, it is for families and youth. So as these recommendations are implemented, it's going to touch your broader homeless population.
Thank you. Am I allowed to, or am I done?
We can't see the time that's remaining, so.
He has time remaining.
3 seconds.
3 seconds, okay. If you start, you get to keep going. The reason I would just want to share with my now peer commissioners and fellow council members, as we look at implementation, that it is my belief that if we don't address these larger issues that are indicative of young people without adequate family or institutional support, if we don't address the problem with children and families, we are setting ourselves up for permanent homelessness, permanent addictions, permanent criminal activity, permanent poor health. And if it's in the report, I apologize, but I think these are invisible multipliers. And I think they tell us what common sense tells us, that the issue is pretty big. It seems to be endemic in America's political economy at this point in time. And I think it's really important as we look at implementation. And thank you for the extra time.
Councilor Semple.
Thank you. Thank you for this report. I'm exhausted, especially with how fast you talk. It's great. I don't think I can do it. A couple things have been approached about the other populations. I also think that as we work on this coordination, that will also be a model for the smaller groups. So I'm encouraged by that. I really also like the system coordinating, cooperating approach. However, it's huge. I mean, this is a huge thing that's mapped out here. And I'm curious as to how much we really think is realistic, how much money is really there. Most of the lists of places that we're funding were grants. And this is a lot of stuff to get from grants. So I like it a lot, but I'm concerned with the FTEs and just the building of the supported shelter and all of the facilities we need to implement the ideas. How are we going to pay for it? You know, it's going to employ a lot of people. How are we going to pay for it? And then also, I'm a little bit confused about, as you know, I hear how much our population is going to increase, and now even more with fire and drought refugees. And yes, we'll never get rid of all the homeless. Some people even like it. But to say it will decrease in 3 years, do you mean percentage-wise or actual bodies? So those are my concerns, and I didn't give you any time to answer them.
Just the question that I heard, it's actually the actual number of people who are experiencing unsheltered and literal homelessness would be going down, not as a
even
percentage of per capita.
30,000 more people and possibly more. You know, I don't think we have the jobs and the houses, even though we need them. How are we going to build them? It's great. I just don't know how to make it happen.
Okay, Councilor Taylor.
Okay, question, you said a low barrier shelter for 75 people, is that right? And I think I heard you say for people who didn't want to be in another shelter or didn't fit, where are the other shelters?
So, for individuals, your largest shelter beds is Eugene Rescue or Eugene Mission, which has barriers to entry, essentially, right? So you have to be. I wouldn't be doing justice, but I don't know them off the top of my head. But I know there's a sobriety requirement. There's no drug requirement. I believe that at some point you have to accept case management services. So a low barrier shelter would have none of those requirements. So it'd be for folks that wouldn't be eligible or wouldn't be allowed or able to meet the requirements of Eugene Mission, and instead
We're talking about the mission then. But we don't have a publicly supported shelter.
No.
No. And if it's low barrier, would people have to be alcoholics or drug addicts to get into it?
No, it's just saying, it's really the idea is that folks that couldn't normally and wouldn't normally access a shelter with a lot of rules, they would go to that shelter. They would be able to be admitted into that shelter as a safe place.
So you're thinking of the mission. That's the only one I know of that we have, besides sponsors, which is transitional.
It's the only one that we know.
Yeah, that's year-round in Eugene for individuals.
Our experience, the folks that, and this isn't just specific to the mission, for traditional emergency shelter throughout the country, folks who have the least ability to access those beds due to their own barriers, challenges, diagnoses, whatever it may be, are the ones who need them most. So it's really talking about putting the emergency back in emergency shelter and making sure that we're meeting the needs of the population who need those beds the most. So that's what we mean by low barriers, having a place for people who do have active substance use issues, mental health issues, no income, criminal histories. those are often the folks that need intervention and services most quickly.
Okay, I'm thinking about lots of people who might be homeless tomorrow because they can't pay their utility bills and they don't have any kind of mental illness or anything, just no money. And I think we need shelters for those kinds of people who would hope that it would be temporary, not forever. But thank you, that's all.
All right.
Thank you. You guys are superstars, and I don't have time to tell you why. So you're going to have to hold on that one. I've heard you guys talk a couple of times before. You one time before, and then Alex 3 times before. So I'm going to be very, very quick. You know, this is daunting. What you've outlined is an outstanding program. You've brought together a whole lot of threads for us to bind together. Now it's our job to bind them together. And it really is daunting. I was first appointed to the Human Services Commission 2 years before Councillor Taylor was elected to her first office. That's a long time ago. And in those years, what we've done is a whole lot of hand-wringing. Well, right now, because of something that Councillor Pryor said, cooperation, not just coordination. I really am optimistic that we're moving into the future. Now, I'm going to point out 4 different areas. We're going toward functional zero, and we need, Doug, in your quote, we can't end homelessness without a substantial increase in housing units. Of course, we need lots and lots more front doors. That being said, we have 4 different areas that are targets of opportunity that you've outlined here. The first is coordinated entry. We have a coordinated entry system, and we're good. And I thought we were really good. You guys have pointed out that we can get better, and that's encouraging because I think we can. And you've actually given us ways to do it, and I love that. I'm not going to go into details. The second is the more robust interaction with our landlords and helping them, inducing them to become a part of the solution. We can do that. We've done it in outreach before. During Operation 365, we called the landlords. I'm running out of time. Utilization rate, getting the mission and all of our current providers to utilize more. That's daunting, but it'll have huge impact. And then significantly, the most important one to me is move through of our system, particularly as we build permanent supportive housing units. Moving people through the system. You're suggesting 5%. I think that's going to be a very low number. I think if we are good at it, we'll move people through that system faster, but it requires lots and lots and lots more houses. I'm out of time, a lot more to say, but you guys really are superstars. Sometime I'll tell you why.
Okay, I have 2 councilors wanting a second run. Councilor Ye, do you need a? Okay, so I have 3. So Councilor Clark, then Councilor Surratt, and if time, Councilor Slater.
Thank you, Mayor.
Perhaps we can get the commissioners one round first.
Oh, yes, correct.
You want to have
You're good.
him go first?
You're good, just go for it.
Or
No,
Heather?
I'll have Commissioner. Maybe we should just have the commissioners go at least once.
First round.
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Sorry.
There you go.
All right. As somebody who's worked in housing, especially affordable housing in our area, and worked with St. Vincent de Paul a lot, I'm actually related to the director of St. Vincent de Paul and have ownership in a company that provides services to that agency, and I don't think that actually poses an actual conflict of interest. I think it actually provides some insight into the depth of what we're discussing here. And I'm used to working on projects like this, not to this scale, but in piecemeal. And some of the things that really came out to me was this is really going to require more robust, centralized, coordinated housing program than what we currently have separately, both with Eugene and with the county. The staffing costs that are in Appendix E, I think, are low. I don't think they're realistic for what we really are asking for. And I'm concerned that we are not looking at that real cost that this is going to take to implement. I'm also very familiar with the funding sources that are laid out in this particular material, and they're very specialized. They require very specific grant writers, and they are in high demand, and we will have to afford them in order to really implement this plan. And how we're going to divvy that up between city, county, I don't know, but that's a question we need to tackle. And the last thing I wanted to add was this, the assumptions of reducing the homelessness or reducing the unsheltered with 350 PSH units is kind of presented in a way in which it will magically appear. But we actually do need to build those. And although we have some in queue,
We don't have them all in queue, and those are additional funding sources outside of the costs that we've been presented in the appendix. So it's just a final caution about the price tag that we're talking about to implement the full program.
Okay, Councilor Clark.
Thank you. I really appreciate Commissioner Buck's remarks. That gets at the heart of why I was saying the question I was earlier about why are we assuming that people will live alone? Because I think too that the amount of staffing that we're talking about to execute this plan may be shot a little low of what will be required, and the amount of money we're talking about is substantial. The other piece too is, for me, we don't talk about this. I want to say this. There's an assumption inlaid in this that although this is a low barrier shelter, there won't be rules about alcohol and rules about drugs for that people have to comply with in order to be sheltered. Are there no rules that people would have to uphold in order to be sheltered?
Low barrier doesn't mean no barrier, and health and safety are always considered. So most low barrier shelters don't allow for, say, active use in the shelter setting or bringing in paraphernalia. Some low barrier shelters actually have lock boxes for paraphernalia at the front door so that in the shelter setting, things are safe. But aside from immediate health and safety issues, folks that are under the influence but don't present a safety risk to themselves or others, or folks with criminal histories, as long as those criminal histories are not related maybe to if you've got somebody who has a criminal history that within the shelter setting with certain populations, but generally speaking, we're talking about folks that present with serious challenges.
Do you have any estimation on what percentage of our homeless population those rules would cover?
I don't think we can answer that intelligently. No.
The reason I say that is because we're talking about functional zero, and I get that doesn't mean absolute zero, but it's my experience, and I'm not the expert that so many are in this work. But it strikes me that there are an awful lot of folks who are homeless who, I want to talk about this with respect and appropriately, who do not like the idea of having to follow arbitrary rules, and as such leads to part of the reason why they're in the predicament they are. And so if there will be some, my question is, how do we get to functional zero if we still have rules we're telling people they have to comply with and not know which percentage we're talking about?
I don't think we're certain of the question. So one, I just want to, so functional zero is a very specific term, and it's not a term that we're using in this. I just want to clarify that for matter of record. But I don't think that we're not saying that folks who maybe don't want to go into a shelter setting are then excluded from the other housing options either. I don't think it's one or the other, and there may be people who do not want to follow shelter rules or go into a shelter setting for their own safety concerns or for whatever predispositions they have toward that setting. That doesn't then mean that they're now excluded from our overall effort to find housing for them, and that's where that outreach comes in. There are people who may resist the services that we've yet to offer them or that we've offered them so far. And I think that's where a lot of this consumer involvement, if there's a cohort or a group of people who do not want to come inside, who do not want to engage in the services that we're offering them through whatever system it's being offered, then maybe that is the key area where we bring in peers and people with lived experience who have also been outside to make sure that they can have some sort of relationship building. So, I mean, I don't think we need to understand how many people have an active substance use disorder to say that it's appropriate for us to make sure we have capacity to serve people regardless of the challenges that they face and the barriers that they face. I don't know how better to answer that question.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this report. I think it's a really great foundational document to see whether these governments can work together and to find the money necessary. I really want to thank Commissioner Buck for her comments about the cost of doing this and whether or not those cost numbers are accurate. But really what's on my mind is how important it is that we move forward, that we actually get the money, find the money, either with existing revenues or more likely because of the cost and perhaps the underestimate of the cost, that we really push the next discussion in terms of where would we get the money. And that would be my focus and hope that our Board of Commissioners will step up to actually be realistic about where the money is going to come from and what the sources will be, so that we're actually going to do the implementation part of this. And that's what I look forward to in terms of our board's consideration of options in the future. And thank you so much.
Councilor Syret.
Thank you, Mayor. So I just wanted to respond to some of the things. Well, first of all, I appreciate the clarification that these recommendations are taking us towards zero or very low unsheltered versus eliminating homelessness. I appreciate that's an important distinction. So I just wanted to offer that for those concerned about the wise use of public dollars, the way we are working now, we are actually squandering some of those public resources because we have beds that are going without people in them right now, today, and every day this week, and every day this month. So that's a lot of public dollars we've invested in providing shelter that's not being accessed. So because we've not been cooperating as effectively as we could. So, you know, I think, yes, adopting these recommendations will obviously require a significant investment, and I appreciate in particular the comments of Commissioner Buck and Sorensen around that. But not following these recommendations will mean continuing costs, both in terms of human suffering and the negative impacts in the neighborhoods, and cost in terms of police response, public works, all the various countless ways that we are currently responding or not responding to this crisis. So there's a cost on either side, and I think we need to recognize that, and we have an opportunity to make an investment that will reduce, tangible human suffering in our community and improve the quality of life for, I think, thousands of people in Lane County.
Another commissioner wants to.
Anyone else? Pat? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I just, a lot of great things said, and a lot of things that we don't have or can't do kind of get a surface. And really what we hear about is what have we learned and what can we do and what do we have to try to do. I'm going to quote two great Johns. Okay, the first John I'm going to quote is John Locke, an English philosopher. He said, "Don't let the things you don't have prevent you from using what you do have." The second John I'm going to quote is John Reese. City-county partnership is as good as it's been in a long, long time. That's what gives me encouragement, is that we do have a great partnership, great cooperation that is materializing, just materializing. And I really have a great anticipation for that maturing and getting even better as we bring the threads together that you all have thrown before us. We have a lot of work to do. It's daunting. And I look at some of the folks in this audience right now who've not been daunted by some of the very daunting things that they've had to do through the years. And, we just do it. We just step out and do it, and we find ways to do it. And if we meet conditions such as 42 FTEs that we can only afford 21, then we meet that condition and we move forward as well as we can. I'm encouraged. I think this is a wonderful report. If you've not read it in full, take the time to read it. It really is brilliantly done. Councilor Zelenka, well worth our money. I agree with you. So I write down quotes. I got a lot of quotes. I'll send them all to you.
Councilor Zelenka.
This is a really big lift. If you add all this up, we're in the neighborhood of $3 to $4 million a year additional ongoing money that we need to implement this stuff, not including capital costs for the navigation center and the permanent supported housing. So it's a huge lift. It's a big deal. But the results could be pretty darn dramatic. If I understand this right, in Appendix C, the system modeling, by the end of 3 years, if we implement all of the recommendations of the 75-bed low barrier shelter, increased utilization, increased turnover, increased diversion, and build 350 units of permanent supportive housing, we get close to or near zero unsheltered people in our community. The literally homeless people goes from 1,500 down to 467, and our unmet need for housing, for permanent housing, goes from almost 1,400 down to less than 300. So the return is huge, and the benefits of potentially doing this are really dramatic. So fortunately, I think we have excellent staff at the city and the county to help us do this. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take a community-wide effort to do this. It's not going to just be the city and the county. The community needs to step up on this because we do need additional funds for this. And so I'm eager to go to the motions and pass these because I think this is a great next step forward with these motions that have been outlined by staff.
Okay, we do have the motions. Councilor Pryor, did you need to jump in one more time?
And this will be related to motions when they come up.
Did you need one?
I think we're dealing with a big, hairy problem. And the longer we leave it, it's just going to get bigger and hairier. So we need to really do something. And I'm really glad we're talking about the cost and the expense, because we've got to confront that piece directly and very forthrightly. But I would caution that as we think about how big this cost and lift will be, we don't start cherry picking solutions and say, well, I can only afford 1, 3, and 5, so I'll only do 1, 3, and 5. We need to figure out a strategy that will allow us to move forward with all of them in a deliberate and cost-effective way. I mean, I'm not daunted by the enormous cost. I just think we need to be smart about how we're going to go about financing it. So with that, I think motion number 3 may be one of the most important ones here, because if you can figure out a way through a steering committee on how we might try to eat this sandwich one bite at a time, it's the way we're going to finally get it down. But I'm really cautioning against being so daunted by the cost that we start separating these out. It has to go together, and it has to be coordinated and cooperative, and we just have to figure out how we're going to pay for it.
All right, I think if we have one more commissioner.
I was trying to get the attention.
Yeah.
I will join all the cheerleaders. Your visual of a big hairy sandwich, though, left me. Again, I'm going to say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That's what I was trying to say earlier. I don't want to overlook that. I also would like, not getting in the way of any of this, but I would also like to suggest that we also need a systemic way to collect more money or redeploy and leverage existing resources, perhaps more equitable than simply the construction excise fee I hear bantied about, because that may end up providing disincentives, and I have some ideas about how we actually could move forward, get more money, et cetera, in a different time. I read the interview list, and yet I also heard you talk about community partners. Do you have any experience? This is an institution-based model, and it's an institution and government capacity-based proposal, which requires grant writers, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with that. My question is, I think we also need to look at the community-based piece of that. And the community-based piece suggests bringing people in the tent that, from what I could at least tell in reading literally 3 times your report, that we need a bigger tent. So, do you have experience partnering groups such as the Lane County Rental Property Owners Associations, Realtors Associations, mortgage brokers groups, the building trades to partner as it relates to retrofitting certain facilities, and groups with resources that care about quality housing and the quality of life, like credit unions, bankers associations, trade associations, school districts? Have you worked with the community-based side of this at all with other communities?
Yes.
Yes. It's in different ways.
So when we think about a continuum of care, which is sort of your overall geographic planning body around homelessness, however you want to define that, I think it is the widest tent possible, and you look to fill specific needs with specific people with capacity to fill those. So your realtors associations helping you with your landlord recruitment, your unions or construction companies that have an interest in charitable, helping you fix units that get destroyed by tenants so you can preserve those landlord relationships, working with your Chamber of Commerce to look for employment opportunities and pathways and creative ways to do that. So the answer is yes, we could probably talk at length about, like, here's examples, but they should be at the table, and whether it's part of, specific steering committees or specific asks, that's important. I think, I'll just reiterate one more time, I think one of the groups that it's often overlooked, not necessarily here, but generally speaking, are consumers and people with lived experience helping to inform how this works. Because if you have to make hard decisions about next steps, they're the ones who know the bottlenecks and what's not working right now that can help inform some of those decisions. I don't know if that gets to.
Oh, good enough for me for right now.
Okay, I think we're at time and we're ready to put a few motions on the table. So I turn to my council president. You could put the first one on.
Thank you. Move to approve the technical assistance collaborative report.
Second.
You need to speak to it, Councilor Clark?
Yeah, that's why my hand's up.
Yep,
Yeah.
got it.
Technically, we often use the word to accept rather than approve. I'm wondering what the definition of approve is in this case. What am I agreeing to?
I think our intent, whether you use approve or accept, is a similar means, because as you go through the rest of the motions, what our plan is to work with the county and come back to this body, either jointly or individually, with a recommended plan of how to actually move all of these forward, and then the council or the commission at that point can choose what you want to do. And if there's budget impacts, all that has to go through a regular budgeting process. So for purposes of here, whether you use approve or accept, from our perspective, the intent's the same.
Thank you. I can support that then. Thank you.
Okay, all in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
You don't get to vote.
I think I got 7. I think I got 7. All
For
right.
goodness sakes, don't demote yourselves, all
And
right?
none opposed. Okay.
How are we going to do
All right.
this? We
Okay.
do it, then they do it?
Well,
or-
for the now, I'm going to work through the city council, and then I'm going to
Okay.
let the county commissioners.
Are we
do
going to
their
let
own process.
Springfield help pay?
Well, okay. So, motion number 2.
Okay. Move to direct the city manager to work with the county administrator to establish by May 1st, 2019, a framework and a plan for implementing the recommendations of the TAC report.
Second.
Any comments, questions? All in favor? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, that passes. Thank you. And the third one?
Move to establish a steering committee to provide feedback during development of the implementation plan, with the steering committee composed of 2 elected officials from each jurisdiction, the Lane County Administrator and the Eugene City Manager, and 2 representatives from the Poverty and Homelessness Board.
Second.
Speak to it, Councilor
Yes,
Clark?
ma'am. Betty has a really great point. If we're looking for representatives in this motion, in no way are we including Springfield in a regional problem. And we're asking for them to support it financially. And I'm a little challenged with that. I got to be honest. I'd like to support this motion, but I think we're premature a little, or we should reword it in some way.
You want to speak to that, manager?
Springfield was not a active partner in the development of this report. Doesn't mean that the city of Springfield won't choose to be, or will want to be, or need to be an active a part of that. I think we also believe that the county, as a countywide agency, also has some representation beyond just Eugene, and will incorporate whom they also need to have in the conversation, not in the steering committee, but in the broader conversation as well. And so I think our intent is to be able to come back to these two bodies with something by May 1st. It may, at that point, suggest that we need to bring Springfield into that conversation differently. They are also represented through the Poverty and Homelessness Board, which is partly why we also have asked them to be a part of this representation as well.
I know Councilor Cyrett wanted to speak to that. Did you also want to speak to that, Commissioner?
Yeah. I would also love, I don't know why your old friend didn't bring Springfield in. I would love for Springfield to participate. I've talked to a couple of the Springfield city councilors, and I don't think there's a resistance for the discussion. I can tell you that their focus right now is children and families. I can tell you for a fact, and it's kind of interesting because as we look at Band-Aiding all of this together into that cohesive whole, Springfield is doing some interesting things. The first with the ADUs, waiving system development charges, and looking now at MUPTI as a potential vehicle for developers to develop low-income housing. So I actually think Springfield may bring a lot to the table. Whether it's money or not this go-around, I don't think that's quite as relevant, but we'll engage.
Right. Councilor Cyrett.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out that Springfield Councilor Marilee Woodrow is the chair of the Human Services Commission, and there is representation there too, which is the body that decides where the requests for proposals and the contracts are put out to the nonprofits in the community. So she's definitely read this report, and we discussed it at the Human Services Commission. So, I think Springfield is aware of this work that we're doing, very aware, and it's up to them if they're prepared to participate and, put some funding in beyond what they already contribute, but they're not cut out of the conversation. They are, as a jurisdiction, are definitely involved in the conversation, just they were not part of funding the TAC report. That was a shared cost between the City of Eugene and Lane County, so that's part of the reason why it's coalesced in the way that it has here.
Any other comments? Councilor Taylor.
I'm very skeptical of committees that are only parts of groups, but if they know where to get money, that's great. I'm thinking maybe if we would use more marijuana and redirect the marijuana tax to this purpose, it might work.
Good idea. All right, are we ready for a vote? All in favor of the motion? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Excellent. That passes, and I defer to the commissioner.
So we don't have quite as many formal rules, so I'll just turn it over to the board if you want to take action tonight or if you want to defer that to a subsequent meeting. Go ahead.
We don't have a prepared motion, but, we could.
Here, please.
We don't act on the fly typically. We don't introduce motions that haven't been announced typically. That's not the way we operate. But we do kind of look around the table and say, hey, do you guys like the report? Do you have head nods? Do we want to move forward with the prescribed direction of the report?
I think that would be appropriate to have some comments from the commissioners, and then we'll put this on our agenda for more formal action. But
I'll just rest on things I've already said. I love the report. I'm looking forward to implementing it, and looking forward to working with the City of Eugene, City of Springfield, City of Bonita, Lawrence, Oak Ridge, the whole
shebang.
Shebang. Thank you. That's the word I was seeking.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Jay, Joe, and Heather.
So, thank you, Chair. Mayor Venus sits on the Public Safety Coordinating Council with me, and we just were presented an update of our public safety plan. And one of the things we realized between the last plan and this one was our failure to include some of the partners in drafting that strategic plan. So I appreciate Councilor Clark's comments around that, and I hope we can be flexible with that committee if needed. That said, one of the things that's coming out of that plan is a plan to try and make sure we keep all the wheels moving in the same direction on that bus as they go round and round. And part of that was making sure we don't improve one part of the system too fast for another part. Like, we don't suddenly put a bunch of sheriff's deputies out in rural Lane County and overwhelm our DA's office. Those pieces working together, no different than these pieces of this plan. So it's really critical that we have that committee work together to develop a strategic plan that, with our limited resources, there's no way we're going to fund this thing all at once. It is well over $100 million in capital cost, and it's well beyond $3 million a year in staffing costs. It's more like about $10 million a year in staffing costs when you include the supported housing staffing. So that's a big, big lift. So we're going to have to do it in pieces. So we just have to have a really careful strategic plan on how we move forward in those pieces. I fully, moving to accept the plan, whatever head nods from the commissioners, and to establish the steering committee and provide direction to the county administrator to work with the city on establishing that committee. You've got my head nod on that. I think we should move ahead, but I think it's really important, make sure we get the right people at the table, and we work on a strategic plan.
I have nothing further. I agree with Jay, and I agree with Pat's comments also.
May I, Mr. Chair and Madam Mayor, if I may just add one thing.
Could we have Heather and I
I'm sorry.
on the first
Yeah,
round first?
And this is a more ceremonial, so.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I think it's very important that we all work together on moving this forward, and I look forward to working with both cities in order to make that happen. Just one side is I want to make sure that all our rural communities are included in the discussion, and we're not just centered on the metro center, because this is affecting all of our outside communities, and they live and work in our area as well. So when we look at how to integrate these services, I want to make sure they integrate into our smaller communities as well, and they're not left out of the discussion.
I just wanted to say that based on the feedback from the commissioners, that what we'll probably do is discuss this with our county administrator and put this on our agenda for more formal action to do probably the things on the wall. But one of the things that you will hear from us is a broader concern, whether it's Springfield or rural Lane County, and the impacts of doing all the things that are in the report and the recommendations on the rest of the county. So that'll be a slightly different conversation at our meeting. But I think that there's a lot of energy and excitement about going for the implementation motions that you're approving tonight, and I think it's going to be followed up by similar action.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. Excellent report. I think you've really put us on a constructive path. We appreciate that. Did you have one more thing you wanted to say?
Just one more thing, and we talked about the Poverty and Homelessness Board briefly. I want to just make a note that a former member of the Poverty and Homelessness Board, former Mayor Sandra Larson of Bonita, passed away last week. Mayor Larson was instrumental in bringing the rural community to the table to talk about homelessness and to talk about the positive work that can be done outside of the metropolitan area. So we will miss Sandra Larson, a dear soul who contributed mightily.
Right. Thank you for making that comment and acknowledging her very important contribution. So thank you all very much. The City Council meeting is adjourned.